All right, beef, it's what's for dinner and it's what's for lunch. And in my case, it's what's for breakfast. Now, many of you guys have been trying a carnivore diet, and a lot of you guys are still learning about some of the different cuts of meat. So let's talk about the various cuts of meat and how you might best want to prepare them, because a lot of people don't know this information. So we'll start with some of the easy stuff. And so there's a lot of, steaks that we've all heard of that are very popular. These include things like ribeyes, New York strips, tenderloins, porterhouse steaks, tomahawk ribeyes for that matter, and how you might want to cook those. And so all these steaks, they're very easy to prepare. I mean, you basically a hot pan, some salt, and that's really all you need for something like that. These steaks really are very easy to do. Now, I think it's very helpful to have yourself, a way to measure the temperature. Gosh, if there's one thing I would recommend people do, get a little temperature gauge so you can measure the internal temperature of your steaks. So if you like it cooked a certain way, take the guesswork out of it. If you're always deciding, trying to guess what temperature it is, you're going to be disappointed all the time. And it's a shame to take such a beautiful cut of meat like that and kind of mess it up. Now, I prefer my steaks, kind of medium rare. I think it's my favorite way to cook them. It's called à point in French, or el punto in Spanish. Just means on point, right? That's how a lot of chefs will tell you how to cook a lot of cuts of meat, particularly these types of steaks. And so whether you air fry it, not my favorite way to be honest, but it works. It works in a pinch. I think, cooking the internal temperature, get it to the temperature you want, and then hot sear. It's called a reverse sear technique. You can use a cast iron pan. I've got a grill that goes up 1,500 degrees, which is quite nice. And, and I cook it just a little bit under, and particularly how thick the steak is. The thicker the steak is, the closer you can bring it to the final temperature before you put it for the sear. If it's a very thin steak, you got to drop it, maybe 10 degrees or something like. So bring it to 120 degrees internal and then sear it off and get it up to that 130 range or something like that. So these steaks, like I said, ribeye, New York strips, tenderloins, porterhouses, even a tomahawk ribeye. Tomahawk ribeyes tend to be a little bigger. So again, a little bit longer on the cook, and a little closer to the final temperature before you sear it. Those things are very good. For you guys that don't know where these steaks come from, the ribeye steak comes from, the upper ribs of the cow. New York strips come from the short loin. It usually has this nice little bit of fat on there that a lot of people like. The tenderloin also comes from the short loin. So muscle doesn't work very hard, so therefore it's quite tender. So muscles that work really hard, like the leg muscles, if we took a look at the shanks, they tend to be tougher cuts. We'll talk about those in a little bit later. And then the porterhouse, if you guys don't know, it's very similar to a Tbone. In fact, they look very similar. The only difference between a porterhouse and a Tbone is porterhouse is a New York strip on one side and a fillet on the other side. And that fillet on the porterhouse side has to be at least, I think, 3 inches to be considered a porterhouse. It might be 2, but I think it's 3. If it's smaller than that, they call it a Tbone, just so you know the difference. These things are all great. Now, here's some other cuts that are equally delicious and also eat very well, but they're not as well known. So we'll talk about those. And you can cook them in a very similar style. So the chuck eye steak, chuck eye steak is kind of right next to the ribeye on the cow, and it eats very much like a ribeye. It tends to be a little cheaper, and it's just there's not very many of them, so often the butcher will take it home to himself. Now the Denver steak is another cut of meat that's not that popular. Not too many people have heard of it. It's an extremely tender cut of the meat. It comes from the shoulder blade area of the cow. It's got enough marbling to provide this excellent flavor, and it cooks really well. A top sirloin is a little bit leaner, but it's very, very flavorful, and you can cook it things like tallow or something like that to bring a little more fat to it. The picanha, which is basically a top sirloin with the fat cap left on there, is a wonderful cut of meat. It's kind of a specialty to places like Brazil or Portugal, where I'm going to next week to go visit. I'll hopefully have some picanha while I'm there. That's something that also is just tremendously good. And then, of course, the Tbone. One thing about cutting steaks, which is an important thing, steaks have a grain. Most muscle bellies, like the fibers in my biceps run this way. And when I tension it, it's very tough. But if I were to cut it like that, right across the grain, it would become really flaccid and loose, and it becomes easier to chew. That's why we cut against the grain. We're trying to, there's some built-in tension in those muscle fibers, and when you cut through across the grain, you break down that tension, and it actually is easier to chew. So one thing to know, even in some of these, like you get a strip steak or a skirt steak rather, and it'll be long like this, but the grains are running, the grains are running this way, so you still have to cut it, against the grain, so you can get it, nice and thin. So steaks like flat iron steaks, skirt steaks, flap steaks, and flank steaks all kind of have that same configuration. Finally, there's some other cuts of meat that are, you're going to be a little more deliberate about. These are tougher cuts of meat. These are things that are going to take really often a slow approach. So things like brisket. The best way to make a brisket is on a smoker, kind of Texas style, little salt and pepper. Put it on there. You cook it for, 12, 16 hours, depending on how how big the thing is, and that's going to give you a wonderful cut. It's too much to go into how to cook a brisket on this video, but trust me, that is a wonderful, wonderful way to do it. And it's usually economical. You usually pick up a decent brisket for about $4 a pound, sometimes even $3 a pound, depending where you go, and you can make that into one of the most delicious cuts of meat if you take your time. If you don't, and you try to rush it, you're going to have something chewy that you're not going to enjoy most. And, same thing with a chuck roast. Chuck roasts are, again, they tend to be, 3 to 4 pounds in size. You have to have some decent fat in them. They can be tough unless you cook them nice and slow. So I'll sometimes sous vide those for 12, 24 hours. You can obviously put them in a pressure cooker or something like that, cook them nice and slow. Same thing with beef ribs, ossobuco, oxtail, or any kind of other shank meat, that you might run into. These things are all going to be best prepared in a nice, slow fashion. All right, guys, let me know what you guys think. If you got any tips you want to share, your favorite way to make either tough cuts of meat or just your favorite way to cook a steak, let me know in the comments. All right, guys, thanks a bunch. Like, subscribe, hit the notification bell. We'll see you on the next video.